This is the Dean Abbott podcast. Tonight I'm talking to Joshua Gibbs, who is an educator and author of, is it 3 books now?
It's 5 now, and a 6th
5.
coming out.
When I say 3, you know I mean 5.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, but I first came to know about you through some blog posts that you wrote for the Cersei Institute. And the one that really caught me was one that you wrote about Frog and Toad. Do you remember that?
Of course, yes.
And you're a fan of Frog and Toad.
Love Frog and Toad.
What do you like about Frog and Toad?
I like pretty much all of the Frog and Toad stories because, well, the argument that's laid out in that article is that the way that Frog and Toad solve their problems is it's very similar to the way that real people ought to solve their problems. And as opposed to a lot of modern books where there's really no crisis, there's no problem to solve, there's no virtue required of a person in a difficult situation, Frog and Toad consistently encounter problems for which some fairly conventional virtue is the answer. Like courage, wisdom, self-control. Some of the best stories in Frog and Toad are just these little illustrations of why the good life is a life that embodies self-control or wisdom, or sacrifice, or there's some problem that emerges in the world for which some rather conventional kind of selfless act is the way over it or the way through it. I love that.
Isn't there a story where Frog can't stop eating cookies?
Yes, Frog and Toad cannot stop eating cookies.
And I don't remember how they get out of it.
Well, they get out of it. That's one of my favorites. That's one of my kids' favorites as well. Toad makes some cookies. The cookies are so good that Frog and Toad cannot stop eating them. And so they come up with all of these ineffective solutions for the problem of their own gluttony. And so as opposed to getting rid of the cookies, they go through 3 separate stages of making the cookies difficult for them to eat. But they simply overcome the difficulties that they set up. So, one of the solutions is let's put the cookies in a box and then set the box on a high shelf. And of course, as soon as they do that, they just get a ladder and take the cookies down and keep eating them. And Frog says in the end that the only real solution is to get rid of the cookies. And so I love the fact that they don't destroy the cookies. They give them away. They give them away to the birds of the air. And the birds come down and they eat the cookies. And Frog, the story resolves with Frog saying, well, we got rid of the cookie problem. And Toad says that he's going home to bake a cake. And so I think Frog and Toad, Frog is often, it's not always the case that Toad doesn't learn his lesson. Frog is the one who often learns the lesson, and Toad seems like he's a few steps behind actually coming to grips with how difficult the thing is that they have to do.
And so, like people, they come up with ineffective solutions to their problems.
Often, and then the effective solution, in the story Cookies, the effective solution is the one that entails some real selflessness on their part, and that's unpleasant. It's not pleasant to be selfless. It's good to be selfless, but it's hard to be selfless because it's not fun. And a lot of times the stories of Frog and Toad are only resolved when they agree to do a thing that is not fun, that the solution to the problem in front of them is to not have fun. And modern people tend to be obsessed with fun, which makes the Frog and Toad stories I feel like they're fairly confrontational anymore. They might have gone down easy back in the 70s, but many of those stories be deeply offensive to modern readers because they're not sentimental. They entail some amount of suffering on our part. And it's an exoneration of suffering. Not all suffering is bad. Some suffering is redemptive.
How do you tell the difference
between
suffering that's bad and suffering that's redemptive?
Well, in a children's story, I think that redemptive suffering is suffering that is shown to be worthwhile, and that could be for your sake or that could be for someone else's sake. So suffering is worthwhile if there is something physical suffering is worthwhile if there is some spiritual gain that comes from it. So that's the exchange, of course, that we're often asked to make, is to give up the pleasure of the body for the pleasure of the soul. And this is always what, this is always the choice that Christ is laying out for his followers, especially in the Sermon on the Mount. You can have your good things now, or you can have them later. And if you have your good things later, your Father in heaven will repay your suffering here on earth. And he can repay your suffering far better than anyone on earth can.
Mm-hmm.
So you're better off suffering now and waiting for vindication, as opposed to seeking your vindication in your pleasant things now. And that's a rather grand theological theme, but I do think that's kind of present in the Frog and Toad stories, albeit in this very charming kind of childlike way.
What do you think makes that so hard for people to do? I mean, even people who believe what Jesus is saying in the Sermon on the Mount, what makes that such a difficult thing to do?
Well, I think that we live in a sentimental age. And when I say that, I mean, we find it hard to believe that asking others to suffer, requiring them to suffer, or suffering ourselves is ever really worth it. And I think that this is because we really doubt in the existence of the soul. I mean, we might say we believe in the soul, but it's one thing to say that you have a soul, and it's another thing to behave in such a way that manifests a belief in the soul. And suffering is, when suffering is undertaken willingly, as opposed to begrudgingly, suffering can be redemptive. And it's redemptive when it's undertaken willingly, because it is resigning your will to a higher will that the Lord gives and the Lord takes away. And it's all God's anyway, and whatever he wants to do with it is fine with me. And that requires a great degree of humility. But it also requires a great degree of faith that God repays, that lo, I am coming and bringing with me my recompense, as the Lord says in Revelation. And so it involves patience and looking forward to being vindicated and not seeking your vindication now. And that's very difficult. It's very difficult for a sentimental people to be willing to suffer now for rewards that they can scarcely imagine and are not 100% confident that they're ever going to receive.
It seems to me too that there's more than one kind of suffering, and that what you're describing in Frog and Toad, where they give away the cookies, this is a kind of suffering that's just sort of born out of the necessity of the virtue, right? Like if you're going to have that's very different from a suffering that's inflicted on you by another person's ill will,
Sure.
and that kind of thing. And I think that's the kind of suffering that's harder for me to tell what's redemptive and what is not, right? When you are legitimately the victim of some other person's
Right.
ill will and bad behavior.
Right. I think that sort of thing, that when someone else is, oppressing you or is tormenting you, that there's two responses to that. And I mean, regardless of what your response is, hopefully you call out to God for help. But I don't know that. I think that can lead to a hardness of heart. I think that even ill-founded suffering can make you bitter. But I don't think that it has to. I think that you can suffer at the hands of others and not lash out against God, and give thanks to God in all things, which is say what Job does. Even when Job is terrorized by Satan, he does not accuse God. He wants to speak with God, but he doesn't blaspheme God. He doesn't fall prey to the temptation to lash out in anger. And I think that's the responsibility of a person who is being treated unfairly, is to render that suffering unto God, and to ask God to stick up for you. Anyway,
So I'll say two things about that. Here's a couple of thoughts or concerns around this issue. I'd see what you think.
Yeah.
My first concern is that when we talk about redemptive suffering, it is very easy to imply that suffering is itself a good
Right.
when it is not. Um, no matter how great an amount of good that comes from it,
Agreed.
it is itself not a good. And so suffering, while unavoidable, is not something to be itself sought. That's
Yeah, I would agree with that. That when we talk about redemptive suffering, I mean, we could say the same thing that we could say of suffering. We could say of death, right?
Mm,
Death is never good. Death is unnatural. Death is God's enemy.
mhm,
Wherever we have seen death, we have seen that thing that Christ came to defeat.
mm,
And yet, I could see referring to a sacrificial death as a good thing, not the death itself, but the humility required to yield one's life for another person. So death is still the enemy here. Death is not redeemed in and of itself, because the person is redeeming the life of another by yielding his life.
right.
But it is, yes, I agree with you entirely. That in the same way that suffering itself is not good, but suffering can be an opportunity to be patient,
Mhm.
and that patience is good. I totally concede the point. I wouldn't want to treat suffering or death as things that are inherently good,
Mhm,
but
mhm.
opportunities for virtuous responses, perhaps.
I think too that people who try to approach death with kind of a redemptive mindset, or death, I'm sorry, suffering with
Yeah,
a kind of a redemptive mindset, they tend to it's easy for them to blow past scriptures like the ones where Jesus tells his disciples to get away from persecution if you can.
right.
And I just think sometimes that's the moral duty um is to kind of flee from people who are doing you evil.
Sure. Yeah, agreed.
Mhm.
Fleeing is even an option that the Lord Himself takes. Right.
That's
That's,
right.
yeah,
Yeah.
wasn't His time, so he disappeared. He evaded them.
Mhm.
Um, so yeah, I mean, if the Lord does it, He commands the apostles to do it. Then certainly possible for people in bad relationships to do it as well.
Right, right. The before we leave Frog and Toad, well, now that we've wrapped up the problem of suffering, I'd
All
like to
done.
talk. I'd like to talk a little more about children's literature.
Yeah.
Um, my children are now 17 and 13, so they're kind of beyond the little kids' movies and stories kind of age.
Yeah.
But one thing I've noticed a lot is that if you look at contemporary media, whether that's books or movies or television, cartoons, animated features, whatever, for kids versus even things that were made in the 70s. The spirit of them, I don't know if you've noticed this, the spirit of them is totally different. And flat. Contemporary stuff tends to be flat, I think. And I just wondered if you've noticed that and why you might think that is.
I think that a lot of that happens when the motion picture production code ends in 1968
Mm,
and the rating systems emerge. And the reason for that is prior to the end of the MPAA, the Hays Code, films tended to not be made for particular age groups, or at least it wasn't as common for a film to be made for a particular age group.
mhm,
So a great example of this, one of my favorite examples of this, is the film Roman Holiday with Gregory Peck and Audrey Hepburn. That is a movie that I'm 42. I can enjoy that movie. I think a high school student could enjoy that film. I think an elementary school student of 8 or 9 could enjoy it, and they're all enjoying it on different levels. But films used to be made. It was assumed that most films, not all films, of course, but most films were suitable for wide family viewing. And that was back when films didn't parse up audiences by age. And one of the things that happens after the end of the Hays Code is the rating system emerges, and the rating system really parses things out by age: G, PG, R, and then later PG-13 and NC-17. And all of these have largely come to sort films by the ages that are thought appropriate for this story. And over the last, Hays Code ends in 1968, over the last 50 years or so, this has ultimately shaken out into this entertainment industry that makes that makes films and TV that are like kind of hard coded for adults, or hard coded for teenagers, or hard coded for little kids. And there's very few things like Roman Holiday that everyone could watch and everyone could find satisfying. Those are relatively few. They happen from time to time. But I think that there was almost this conscious effort made mid-century, a little after mid-century, to tailor a lot of pop culture to this new demographic known as teenagers. The word teenager isn't older than the 1940s. It's really invented by advertisers to create this new market for things specifically purchased for a very narrow age range. Whereas prior to that point, it was assumed that if you're 14 or 15, you could be sharing your mother or your father's version of that thing. And so I think the youth culture of the 20th century kind of comes to fruition in the late 60s, early 70s. And now we have cartoons that only a 7-year-old or an 8-year-old can possibly stomach. Whereas if you or I were to sit down and even watch some of the Looney Tunes from the 1960s, 50s or 60s, some of those are still absolutely delightful. They're not it's not sub-intellectual garbage like a lot of stuff that is made for 6-year-olds today. And I think that Hollywood has really broken up the family by ages, and that's not done us any favors long term.
Tell us a little bit more about what you do. You not only are an author, but you're a teacher as well.
Yes.
Tell
I
us
teach classic literature. I teach classic literature in person, and I teach classic literature online. I do some consulting work with schools, and I do a lot of lectures, do a lot of conferences and lectures.
What's classic literature?
Classic literature. Well, this year I'm teaching medieval literature and early modern literature. In my last book, Love What Lasts, I present an argument for a classic thing being something wherein the author has been dead, or the creator has been dead for more than 100 years. And that's not a completely original argument. Some of that is borrowed from Remy Brague of the Sorbonne, and some excellent articles that he's written for First Things on the subject of secularism, which I would recommend to anyone. Very, very. I discovered those about 10 years ago, and I've basically just been retreading his ideas for the last decade. I think Brague's an amazing scholar. So in the classroom, in a classical classroom where I teach, I try to, the curriculum is mainly composed of books that have stood the test of time. And at least so far as I'm concerned, that means the author's been dead for over 100 years. That doesn't mean I don't read recent books. I mean, I write recent books, for crying out loud.
Yeah.
But in terms of the things that are taught in the classroom that are worthy of having an adult explain something to 20 kids, things that kids are never going to read on their own and need someone to help them understand. Those are the kind of books that I teach. So right now, just finishing up the Song of Roland in my medieval literature class. We read the Constellation of Philosophy earlier this year. And in an early modern literature class, we just finished up Pride and Prejudice.
Oh, that's a good book.
Love it. Love it.
What do you have to say? What do you have to say about that And what does that book have to say to teenagers?
You know, when I start teaching Pride and Prejudice, I teach it to sophomores, and I generally assume that my students are at about the same level of awareness or unawareness of the world that I was when I was
Mm,
their age.
mm,
I haven't found it to be profitable to assume that kids are dumber now than they were 25 years ago, or that kids are smarter now than they were 25 years ago. That it pays for the teacher to remember his own youth and to assume that what you recall about your own youth is largely present in the hearts and minds of your students. So, Pride and Prejudice is a book about romance. It's a book about love. It's a book about marriage. It's a book about unhappy marriages and the search for a happy marriage.
mm.
The heroine of the book comes from a family where her mother and father don't have a good marriage. And yet she is convinced that a good marriage is possible. I don't know that there's a really great marriage on full display in Pride and Prejudice. There's some marriages that we can assume are happy enough, but they're not on full display. They're kind of in the sidelines. And the marriages that Austen shows us tend to be fairly unhappy or just unremarkable. The people who are in those marriages don't regard marriage as a deeply personal, spiritual, artistic project, which is what the heroine Elizabeth Bennet believes marriage can be, wants marriage to be. And I think that, when you're 16, it's easy to be sympathetic to Elizabeth's idea of marriage. You want a good marriage. You want a marriage that's deeply personal, and it's a spiritual project. It's not just an economic enterprise. It's not just sleeping with your roommate. But that kind of marriage requires a lot of preparation, and that's something that I talk about in the class. Elizabeth will make a great partner for Mr. Darcy, and Mr. Darcy will make a great partner for Elizabeth, but there are some significant things they need to realize about themselves before they can be really prepared to enter into a happy marriage. And so I use that book as a challenge to my students to evaluate, take stock of their own souls, and to consider what kind of person they want to marry and what they need to do in order to make ready themselves to marry the kind of person that they want to marry.
Do you think studying Pride and Prejudice is itself a kind of preparation for marriage for them?
It can be. I mean, if you give yourself over to, if you're open to the somewhat difficult lessons that the book has to offer, if you use the book as an opportunity to repent, to take stock of your soul and repent where that's needed, then absolutely I do. I mean, it's possible to reduce the book to a plot and to not take it to heart. But I do think that the book, when best read, when understood in the spirit in which it was written, is absolutely an opportunity to spiritually prepare yourself for marriage.
Mm-hmm. What's the lesson that needs to be learned from it?
A number. One of Elizabeth Bennet, one of the most important lessons that she needs to learn, broadly speaking, is humility. And for her, that means recognizing that she takes more after her mother than her father, despite the way that she wants to think of herself. Elizabeth judges her mother very harshly, and yet has a lot of the same sins that her mother has. For Mr. Darcy, it means evaluating the way that he was brought up. He thinks highly of his parents. He loves his parents, but it's not until late in the book that he's capable of making an informed, loving, but tough judgment of the way that his parents raised him. And he's not humble. I don't think that he's humble enough to be husband material until he can recognize that there were some deficiencies in the way that he was brought up.
Mr. Darcy is, what's the word? There is something in him at the beginning that's almost vengeful, I think. He has a kind of resentment of, well, of society in a way.
Yeah.
It comes out at the ball at Netherfield. It comes out the first time he talks to Elizabeth about marrying, where he basically says, Even though you're not good enough for me, I'd still like to marry you.
Yeah, kind of. That's the proposal. That's about
Right.
halfway through. But yeah,
Right.
yeah, it is similar. Yeah, that's kind of what he says. Yes.
Mm-hmm. And and I suppose in a way it's a story of his overcoming his prejudice in a way.
Yeah, it's overcoming his pride. When
Mhm.
he proposes twice to Elizabeth. The first time he proposes, he's quite arrogant, and he's so arrogant that he hasn't considered how she perceives him. He assumes he's a catch, and then everyone thinks he's a catch, and that she'll be flattered by the proposal, which means he doesn't even really try. And she points this out to him, and he feels horrible about it. The end of that proposal, at the end of that failed proposal, she tells him that he has not behaved like a gentleman, and he is deeply wounded, and he leaves, and he just has months to stew on this, and it wounds him at first, but in short order, he realizes that it is entirely true, that he was quite the bore. And so he makes these changes in the way that he interacts with other people because he takes that criticism deeply to heart. And the criticism that he has for her, she ultimately takes to heart, which is that Elizabeth prizes herself as being someone who understands human character very deeply, very intuitively. And he tells her that she doesn't. You think you understand people quite well. You really don't. And so they're good for each other in as much as they're both capable of speaking difficult truths and critical truths to one another. And ultimately, they get over just the inherently offensive nature of being told something that's critically true. And they're both able to resign themselves to the fact that the criticisms of the other are fair and that they need to change the way that they treat other people and the way that they think of themselves. So I don't know. I love that book. I've read it, I don't know, 10 times in the last couple of years.
Obviously, that book has much to say about women and about being a woman.
For sure.
Do you find that your male and female students relate to that kind of work differently?
Initially, the boys do. The
Mm,
boys, over the first 30 or 40 pages of the book, think that it's a teacup and doilies kind of story.
mhm.
And at a certain point, they realize that this is a book about human nature, and there might be teacups and dances and that kind of thing, but that the relationships between the characters and the characters themselves are compellingly drawn. Everyone in the story, I like that everyone in the story has some chips to play with.
Mm,
No one is powerless in this story. Everyone's got something that someone else is intrigued by or
mm,
wants. And so all the characters are just so beautifully, carefully arranged that it's almost like a Calder mobile. Like it's all just very precariously, but level, And I think as soon as the boys come to terms with the fact that they have something to learn from this story, that they have some things to learn about women in this story.
mhm.
At the age of 16, one of the things I tell my students when we open it is, like, all of you are too young to get married, but you're not too young to get ready to get married. Like, it's the time to be thinking about it, not the time to be, casually dating. But it is the time at 16 to begin considering your future as a husband or wife, if that is what God leads you into. Marriage is a noble calling. It requires some preparation. Now is the time that you ought to be preparing yourselves for that. Even if marriage is years off, anything that's very difficult and very important requires some amount of preparation. So now's that time. And this book is an opportunity for you to think about the kind of preparation that you need to put into getting married so that you can be a good husband or a good wife someday.
We'll have to do this again sometime and only talk about Jane Austen.
I love it.
How did you come to be doing all of this? How did you become a teacher of classical literature and an author?
I bluffed my way into it about 19 years ago now. I was a terrible student in high school, terrible student in college. I had a few talents in the way of writing that I had cultivated from the time I was 15 or 16. And I was able to leverage what talent I had in writing to get a job, a very, very, very part-time job teaching composition at a school where classes really only met once a week.
Mm.
So it's very low stakes.
Mm-hmm.
The pay was non-existent. My qualifications were non-existent, so it worked out nicely. And over the course of my first year doing that, I had some success. I was given more to do my second year, was successful at that. And by the end of my third year, I had made enough of my rookie mistakes as a teacher. And I graduated from college with a degree in creative writing.
Mm-hmm.
And a friend of mine had gotten a job at a classical Christian school. And he wrote me a great letter of recommendation. And I got in. And I was horribly unprepared for it. I think that's a thing a lot of first year teachers say. But in my case, it was actually true. I was horribly unprepared for it. I was way underqualified for it, but I absolutely adored it. I had a really great high school experience. I loved high school.
Mm-hmm.
And so going back to high school was something I was entirely ready to do. And so the first year was difficult, like it is for all first year teachers, but I loved it. And never really looked back after that. And that was, when I leveraged that and began working with a friend, that was at like a 5-day-a-week conventional 8 till 3 kind of school.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But it was, I enjoyed it. It was rewarding. It was the first time in my life that I had real job satisfaction. And I began to gain a taste for the things that I was teaching. I do a lot of the reading out loud in class. I don't assign a lot of reading homework. I do almost all the reading in class.
Okay.
I think that the weight of a book and the authority of a book and the beauty of a book don't come across all that strongly, at least in terms of classic literature, when it's being read incompetently.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's important for everyone to learn how to read out loud, but I don't think that Milton in front of 20 people is the right place to learn to read out loud. Mm-hmm. I think that a good literature teacher is doing a lot of interpretive work for students just in the way the text is read. And the teacher is bringing a text alive by reading it with expression, reading it with authority, reading it in a loud, clear voice at the front of the class. And if you're familiar with Pride and Prejudice or Paradise Lost or the Divine Comedy, you can make the book make sense just in the way that you put inflections on words and do little spot paraphrases and translations as you go along. And I want the student to have a rich experience with the text. I don't want kids, with NPR on in the car driving home, kind of reading a chapter of Paradise Lost and not really understanding it, and then pretending to discuss it the next day. Like, that's just terrible. Yeah. So I lavish a lot of attention and time on the texts to prove that they're important. And also to kind of prove that these books are more interesting than I am. The responsibility of the teacher is not to say interesting things every day. I mean, if you're teaching classic literature, I'm more interested in making Milton clear to my students, making Austen clear, than I am in just sharing random thoughts that I have about a book, or in fielding random thoughts that students have. Like, I love a good conversation about a book, but it really needs to be about the book. And I found that if I'm going to have a conversation with my students where they're really going to understand the book so that their opinions really matter on the book, then I need to do the reading for them in class, and they're following along in their own books.
One of those books that you teach is The Consolation of Philosophy. That's a big deal to you.
Yes, sir. Love that one.
It's such a big deal. You wrote a whole book about it.
Yes, I did. Yes. How to Be Unlucky is a bit of a personal memoir, and loose commentary on Boethius's The Consolation of Philosophy.
What would you say that book is about? If you summarize that book for people, how do you do it?
The Consolation of Philosophy.
No, I mean How to Be Unlucky.
Oh, How to Be Unlucky. How to Be Unlucky is, man, a single sentence. The Consolation of Philosophy is the book that you write after something turns you on to philosophy. And I think that in any, any great love that you have for something that's hard to love, there's always one that does it for you, right? Like you might grow up, having sips of your father's wine periodically when you're a little kid. Maybe you graduate to getting a full glass when you're in high school, and then you buy your first legal bottle of wine when you're 21, and wine's not a big deal for you. And then, someday at, 28 or 29 or 30, someone hands you a glass of, a Mouton Rothschild. And you're like, what is this? This is not like the others. And that one doesn't spoil you. It just turns you on to possibilities in a thing that you never knew were there. You're like, wow, I didn't know that wine could do this. And years later, you might, if you become interested in wine, you might describe, quote unquote, the one that did it for you. That was the one that kind of enlivened me to this new thing that I'd never really considered before. Well, The Consolation of Philosophy was the book that it was the first book of philosophy I really understood. It was and in that sense, it was the one that did it for me. And the one that does it for you, the one that like kind of activates your mind and turns you onto it, tends to produce like this kind of massive response. And I would say that How to Be Unlucky is the kind of book that's written out of an overflow of a kind of exuberant overflow of ideas in response to something that's you've only understood for the first time right now in front of you. And so that's what The Consolation did for me. And How to Be Unlucky was the book. It was kind of born out of that excitement, albeit like 7 years after I read it for the first time.
How to Be Unlucky is about virtue, isn't it?
Yes, it is. It's about the difficulty of pursuing virtue. It's about self-awareness. It's about the necessity of self-awareness in gaining virtue. I think of How to Be Unlucky as a fairly confessional book. I wrote that book when I was in my 30s, and I spent the majority of my 30s assessing my 20s and all the mistakes I made in my 20s.
Sure.
And so I would say it's a memoir, because I think of How to Be Unlucky as like the essential book that a young, excited person writes in their 30s, which is just realizing how badly you did your 20s and wanting to do it better.
What forgive me if I'm paraphrasing you poorly, but the central idea that came to me from How to Be Unlucky was that sanity depends on virtue, and that you're going to live your life like frog if you're not pursuing virtue, in the sense that you will build your entire personality around solutions that don't work. Is that accurate?
Yeah, for sure. No, that's a good read. That's a fine interpretation of a lot of that book. I think that again, like thinking of the book as a book you write in your 30s about your 20s, I think a lot of people spend their 20s making a lot of intellectual mistakes that kind of begin to become a bit clearer for you at the end of your 20s. So you live with your parents until you're 18 or 19, and up until that point, up until you leave the house, you can have whatever wacky, stupid ideas you want. And your parents are going to keep you fed and solvent and in a home. And in that sense, up until the time you're 18 or 19, your ideas don't really have to work. You know, you can be a flat earther until you're 18 and nothing's going to go all that badly for you. But as soon as you leave the house, in a very real way, all of a sudden your ideas have to start being like, they have to carry a weight for you. Your ideas have to keep you healthy, and they have to keep you sane and fed and warm. And a lot of people struggle when they leave the house. A lot of people have a turbulent, tough kind of couple of years. They don't respond well to the sudden burst of freedom that you get when you move out of the house. And so they're not quite sure which of their ideas is working. And so, you know, it's almost, you know, these days, it seems almost guaranteed that you have to, for a while, you have to disagree with almost everything your parents told you when you were growing up. And you don't have a whole lot to lose in your 20s, which means that you care a lot about excitement. You don't have a lot to risk in adopting new things and jettisoning old things. But then typically, I think around 26 or 27, a lot of people by the age of 27 have begun to put something together that they're afraid of losing. And at the point that you have something you're afraid to lose, your parents start making a lot more sense to you. Excitement, I would say at the age of 27, excitement becomes less and less important to you. Stability becomes more and more important to you. And you have these things that are precious to you, maybe your reputation, maybe your job, maybe a girlfriend, boyfriend, wife, what have you. And you realize that seeking excitement is dangerous, and it jeopardizes this thing that you've cobbled together. And so you've also figured out by about 27 or 28, which of your ideas is actually working. And so it's possible to change your ideas significantly in your 30s. But I think that by the age of 30, a lot of people have begun sorting out which of their ideas work. So, like, it doesn't really matter which political party you're a part of. If you're 50 and you've got a good job and a happy family and obedient children that love you, if you're a Democrat, you're not going to become a Republican. If you're a Republican, you're not going to become a Democrat. Like, by that age, you've sorted out what works and you've staked your life on it. And you only change that at a horrible risk of everything that you've cobbled together at that point. But I think the point at which you really begin putting that together is your late 20s. And you spend your 30s realizing how much of it you got wrong in your early 20s. And I mean, that's a lot of love what lasts, realizing what I got wrong in my 20s.
How are you connecting what you're talking about there developmentally to the pursuit of virtue?
I'm inclined. Yes, I'm inclined to cut people in their 20s a lot of slack. And it's maybe taken me a long time to get there. I mean, as a high school teacher, as a Christian high school teacher, I've seen an awful lot of my students abandon the faith, you know, and heard about it happening an awful lot. And it's disappointing, and it's vexing, and it's saddening. But so far as connecting all of this to the pursuit of virtue, maybe I can only connect it with a growing sense of a need for patience on my part. You don't really want to judge someone when they're 23. Like, 23 is not the right time to judge whether a person's turned out well. And it's taken me a long time to get to that point. Kind of like you don't want to judge someone when they're like 4, whether they turned out well. So I think that some of the development of virtue is recognizing what stage of life you're in, and recognizing what stage comes next, and realizing what the temptations are to not move into that next stage. What are the, you know, every stage in life comes with certain allowances, privileges, responsibilities. There are things that my students could get away with that I couldn't get away with because more is required of me at 42. There's not as many allowances made for a 42-year-old as a 15-year-old. And I think that there's a real temptation to recognize just how difficult the next stage is, and to want to drag your heels and to not take on the difficulties and the responsibilities of the next stage. But that growing in virtue means not eternally capitalizing on the allowances that are made for people your age, and being willing to do the next thing. And broadly speaking, there's an ultimate sense to that, wherein every stage in this life is a stage of this life, and that the ultimate stage really to contemplate is the next life, and that this life needs to be lived in anticipation of the next life. And a small way in which we learn to do that is to look at the stage we're in and the next stage, and that's like a preparation for this kind of ultimate leap, this passage into the eternal life that we all have to take eventually.
I want to talk about that for just a moment, maybe at a spiritual level.
Yeah.
It's interesting as we talk about Frog and Toad and the cookie story. Yeah. I've been very much affected by this passage near the beginning of New Seeds of Contemplation by Thomas Merton, where he talks about what a human being is and how the human being functions, and talks about his notion of the false self as a sort of protective layer that the human being wraps around himself, full of illusions and falsehoods. And in Merton's prose, the ultimate image is that we wrap these little comforts and illusions and falsehoods around ourselves until essentially we're covered in a shroud, right? It's in our grave clothes, spiritually. And when you said they come up with solutions that don't work, like Frog and Toad, I mean that's one of the things that you wrap around yourself, right? You get attached to your solutions that don't work because the solution that does work is unappealing. How do you think that virtue and the pursuit of virtue, I suppose the pursuit of a holy life, it frees us from that ultimately, regardless of our developmental stage. I mean, obviously developmental stage has something to do with it, but at each stage, like you're saying, we are free to engage in that process of cutting away our falseness.
Right.
What do you think about that?
No, it's a wonderful point. It reminds me a bit of so I have not read New Seeds of Contemplation, but what you described reminds me a lot of what Walker Percy says about the self in Lost in the Cosmos.
A book I have not read. Right.
Okay. Well, the two books are close in a number of ways, probably written fairly close to each other too. That the I don't know whether Percy would say it's always been this way, but in modernity, there's all these identities and selves that people choose to hide behind because they're afraid of being truly known. They're afraid of actually exposing themselves for what they are. And that there are these kind of masks that people are inclined to wear and to shift through at a very quick pace. Where there's all these identities that we can have, that we can trade one for the next. And the only thing that's really required of us in order to shift these identities is to buy a few different CDs, shop at a different clothing store, and maybe change our vocabulary slightly. And you can go from a goth to a jock to a preppy to whatever, just over and over and over again. And Percy's Lost in the Cosmos, he asserts that there's an awful lot of people, not just the young, but many people of many different ages, that are afraid of being known. They are afraid of being judged. They are afraid of knowing themselves as they really are. And so they cycle through these kind of false identities over and over and over again. But the point you made is a very good one. I do think that a holy life frees us from having to hide in that way, because a holy life allows us to acknowledge our own need. A sacred life is predicated upon the need of the secular for something that transcends itself. God is not in the habit of creating holy things. He tends to create common things, and then through a series of rituals and ceremonies, he renders them holy. And that's not always true, but it's kind of just generally true. And when you recognize that that's what the holy life is, that it's about being set apart, that it's about continuously undergoing the ritual and ceremony of God's love in its many forms, then there's no reason to hide. Then you can be yourself with the knowledge that yourself is insufficient, but that God has channels of grace and his own person to offer us, by which we can be made whole and healed. And so, yeah, I totally agree that there's this, I like the image that we wrap ourselves in these facades and this kind of subterfuge.
So,
but that God offers something far greater.
So, essentially, what we've come to is, it sounds like, through the grace of God, we can live lives where we don't have to wrap these solutions that don't work around us, like Frog and Toad, right? Where we can come to know our real selves, like Elizabeth and Mr. Darcy.
Right.
And we can do all of that even if they're suffering.
It's quite good. That's a fantastic encapsulation of.
Is that what we said? Is that what you said?
So let it be written, so let it be done.
We've taken an hour of your time, so I'm happy to wrap up, but tell people where they can find more about you.
Well, I teach online at gibbsclassical.com. If you want to take a class of mine, you can go to gibbsclassical.com and look at my spring offerings. You can sign up for the mailing list, and I do free webinars every now and again on subjects I find interesting.
Great. Thank you so much for doing this. I feel like we need to do it again sometime to talk about Austin, and also I'd like to talk more about God's love.
Love it. I'd love that. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.